Good evening. You're watching the news at 7:30 on ATV. I'm Edna Tse.
And I'm Joyce Woo. Here's a look at tonight's top stories.
Consumer Council urges breakup of power companies' monopoly and overhaul of unfair regulatory system.
Cathay Pacific refuses to discuss impact on flights as pilots start working to rule over pay dispute.
U.S. President expresses concern about Xi Jinping's power, comparing him with Deng Xiaoping. The Consumer Council is urging the government to break up the monopoly enjoyed by Hong Kong's two power suppliers and allow competition in the electricity generation market.
Based on the findings of a comprehensive new study by international experts, the watchdog says the current regulation of the market is unfair to consumers, especially the poor. ATV's Ann Chang reports.
The Consumer Council today unveiled a 170-page report on reforming Hong Kong's electricity market, compiled with the help of international experts over 18 months. Based on their findings, the watchdog is calling on the government to break up the monopoly that just two companies have been enjoying for more than a century. CLP Power supplies 2.4 million households on the Kowloon side, and Hong Kong Electric has more than 500,000 customers on Hong Kong Island and Lamma. The new study has concluded that the current regulation of the electricity market is unfair to consumers. They have no say in the so-called scheme of control agreement that allows the two power companies to earn high, risk-free profits while passing on all the business risks to consumers through tariff increases.
The public basically has no say at the negotiation table and has no access to finding out what exactly is going on in the negotiation process. Consumer interest is currently not represented, not directly represented in the regulatory analysis and the regulatory bargain, and we believe that should change. And we also believe that the monopoly suppliers should not be allowed to exploit their positions.
The Consumer Council wants a regulatory body to be set up to govern the electricity market, boosting transparency and allowing public input. Another key recommendation is to bring more players into the market so that consumers have more choices. Rather than liberalization at the retail level, the experts feel it makes sense to have more competition in electricity generation on a local level, and the government should encourage investment in small-scale production to supply homes and businesses. To further ensure sustainability, they're suggesting more use of renewable energy, which accounts for just 1 to 3% of Hong Kong's power supply.
Governments and large utilities say there's really not much scope for renewables. But when you open up the system and you give renewables the opportunity, it turns out that actually there's much more scope than you thought and the costs are much lower than you expected.
The report does not oppose arrangements to import natural gas from southern China, but it notes that having new nuclear facilities poses uncertainty. The government has already invited public feedback on two key suggestions to meet demand by the year 2023, importing 30% of electricity from the mainland and increasing local gas-fired generation capacity to 60%. The Consumer Council is also concerned about protecting poorer people from rising electricity charges, especially those who share living space, because they share meters and don't pay according to their actual consumption. The watchdog has identified a pressing need to quantify and locate the extent of what it calls fuel poverty.
Price pressures put a great deal of more strain on those who are living on the margins of society. And in each of those areas then, there are great pressures arising, and it's time that Hong Kong looked at the range of policy options to see if through the sorts of measures that we've been identifying, it's possible to rethink and reimagine a way in which the policy, regulation and businesses can work to meet the long-term interests of consumers.
Higher charges are expected next year, with CLP set to be looking at an increase of up to 6%. Ann Chang, ATV News.
Cathay Pacific is refusing to say whether any flights have been delayed or cancelled after pilots began working to rule today over a pay dispute.
The impact is expected to be serious, as hundreds of pilots refuse to do any extra work that's required because of a staff shortage. ATV's Winner Wong reports.
Cathay Pacific customers are facing potential travel chaos as the Christmas holiday season approaches. The Hong Kong Aircrew Officers Association, which represents about 72% of Cathay pilots, began a work-to-rule protest today over a pay dispute. Up to 1,800 out of Cathay's 2,900 pilots will work strictly according to their contracts.
Contract compliance is not a strike. It's not considered an industrial action. But it does mean that many of the things that pilots traditionally will do to assist the company, like working on their days off, they will refrain from doing.
Pilots will also stop the practice of reporting for work early, which may cause delays if flight preparations are not done smoothly. It's the fallout from a year-long pay dispute. The pilots want a pay rise that corresponds to Hong Kong's current inflation rate, which stood at 5.2% for October this year. They've rejected last month's offer by the carrier of a 4% pay rise, backdated to 1st of January 2014, without consulting the union.
The union feels as though this was an attempt to bypass the union leadership and also to undermine them. The pilots voted, by the way, a 92% approval to move forward with this contract compliance. So it's not just the leadership that has taken this step. It is up to Cathay Pacific management to run their airline. And I would have to say that if they were running this airline strictly on the goodwill of the pilots, then perhaps they weren't doing their job properly.
Pilots who have long complained of understaffing and overwork have pointed out that the amount they've been offered is lower than the 4.5% raise announced recently for flight attendants. Their critics say they're already paid too much and Cathay should look to hiring local pilots instead. Cathay today refused to discuss the impact of the latest dispute on its operations during the peak season. It had no comment when asked about any delays and cancellations on the first day of the industrial action. The pilots have warned of disruptions, claiming the airline is already stretched to the limit because the cockpit crew shortage is so severe. They haven't decided how long they will continue with their work-to-rule action or whether it may develop into a full-blown strike. Winna Wong, ATV News.
A hunger strike is starting to take its toll on student activists, with their leader Joshua Wong taking glucose supplements under his doctor's orders.
Wong and his group Scholarism are trying to force the government back into talks on universal suffrage, but the Federation of Students is now looking into the possibility of retreating. Brushing aside warnings that they're fighting a battle they cannot win, student activists from Scholarism continued their hunger strike to press the government to reopen talks on political reform. Last night, 2 more members of the group joined Scholarism leader Joshua Wong and 2 others who started their fast on Monday. Newcomer Gloria Zheng, who is refusing to eat despite her parents' objections, wrote in an open letter that her generation is destined to be at the forefront of the fight for justice in society and to change Hong Kongers' perception that money is everything. The government has flatly rejected the request for dialogue, branding the demand to relaunch the constitutional reform process as impractical and going against legal procedures. The statement added that the 5-step process for universal suffrage has begun and cannot be withdrawn. The hardline response triggered more parties, including the Open University where Wong studies, to appeal to the students to call off their fast, but they refused.
Other than just asking us to stop hunger strike, I believe that it's more effectively for Open University ask the government to having a public meeting with the student. I hope my school can bear more responsibility to solve the problem and the confrontation in the society.
Another prominent force in the pro-democracy protest, the Federation of Students, will decide within the next few days whether to retreat from sit-in zones.
Before they announce this stance, they have noticed us. Scholarism will discuss with our member and volunteer, and also having different arrangement with Federation of Students.
He denied that his decision to go on hunger strike without notifying the Federation first had created a rift between the 2 groups. Wong said his health is holding up, but apologized for taking a teaspoon of glucose on his doctor's orders. The student leader has pledged to drink only water, but heeded his doctor's advice after his blood sugar level had dropped to 2.7, compared with 4 to 7 for a healthy person. Others who are camping out in Admiralty say they are determined to stay on, despite the sharp drop in temperatures as the cold spell begins to bite. A senior U.S. official in charge of Asian affairs has urged Beijing to give Hong Kong a meaningful choice of chief executive candidates.
The State Department official also expressed concern that the central government's commitment to maintaining the city's autonomy is eroding. The Occupy protest movement received fresh support from the U.S. during a meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee.
We believe that the legitimacy of the Hong Kong chief executive will be greatly enhanced by universal suffrage, by an election that provides the people of Hong Kong a meaningful choice of candidates representative of the voters' will. This means allowing for a competitive election in which a range of candidates with different policy approaches are given an opportunity to seek the support of eligible Hong Kong voters.
While Beijing says every eligible voter can cast a ballot for the chief executive in 2017, candidates, 2 or 3 at most, will have to be endorsed by at least half of the nominating committee. The highly restrictive framework has outraged the pro-democracy camp, which took to the streets in late September and has stayed in Admiralty and Causeway Bay ever since.
They've shown that they are willing to express their dissatisfaction and their aspirations directly to the authorities through responsible and peaceful dissent. And that I believe our role is to foster that and to shine a bright light on the situation.
But Russell said the clashes that erupted when police stopped protesters from laying siege to government headquarters earlier this week showed that the potential for violence remains and that all sides need to exercise restraint. He denied Washington had helped the protests. Other speakers backed the senior diplomat's claim that China's commitment to maintain the one country, two systems principle and a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong is eroding.
But it appears very clear to us that China is influencing the implementation of universal suffrage in a way that's inconsistent with the commitment they gave to respect the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it's been now 30 years since the joint declaration.
I mean, they basically signed this agreement and now have found interesting ways to circumvent it, certainly in its application or how it's working.
Yesterday, China told Britain that it has no moral responsibility to Hong Kong now that the city has been reunited with the mainland. The broadside came after British lawmakers denounced China for denying visas to MPs who wanted to visit Hong Kong on a fact-finding tour.
U.S. President Barack Obama has expressed concern about his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping's rapid consolidation of power, comparing him with the late Deng Xiaoping.
Obama said this worries China's neighbors and raises concerns about human rights, but he's convinced Xi wants good relations with the U.S. Less than a month ago, U.S. President Barack Obama held several hours of talks with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping when Beijing hosted the APEC summit. In a meeting yesterday with U.S. business leaders, Obama gave his assessment of Xi.
He has consolidated power faster and more comprehensively than probably anybody since Deng Xiaoping. Everybody's been impressed by his clout inside of China after only a year and a half or 2 years.
Deng, who was in charge from 1978 to 1992, initiated the reforms that enabled China to become the world's second biggest economy and a technological and military giant. But Obama said Xi's rapid consolidation of power has raised concerns.
There are dangers in that on issues of human rights, on issues of clamping down on dissent.
The U.S. leader also noted that with a stronger military and economy, Beijing has been flexing its muscles in the East and South China Seas.
He taps into a nationalism that worries his neighbors and that we've seen manifest in these maritime disputes
Many of the nations involved in the territorial spats are allies of Washington, triggering suspicion in Beijing that the US is ganging up with the claimants to isolate China. Despite his concerns, Obama believes Xi is keen to maintain good relations with the US, pointing to his visit to Beijing as evidence of China's intentions. The two sides still have their differences on trade and currency, cyber theft and electronic spying, military policy and human rights. But Obama said Washington will continue to impress on Beijing that they should work to settle their disputes amicably and elevate their relations to a win-win situation. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying acknowledged differences of opinion between the two countries, but said they should focus on their common interests. And still to come on ATV's main news tonight. New protests in US after grand jury clears another white officer who killed a black man.
Chelsea defeat Tottenham in London derby to stay top of the table.
All about Asia. With geographical advantages, Wuhan aspires to be the industrial and urban center of China. Brimming with potential for tourism growth, Da Nang of Vietnam is on the way to a remarkable success.
We have to create or differentiate our tourism product, improve what we have now.
Boomtown Asia, tonight at 10:05. Get a deeper insight into the key issues of our time. Share unique points of view. The forum. The news. The discussion. All the hottest topics are only on Check In Current News. Newsline. Sunday night at 8.
Share the message of love. Lead you to a new journey of joy. Open your heart to discover the real meaning of life. Leading the Way, Sunday morning at 11.
對付耐藥性惡菌，除咗善用抗生素，仲要揾幫手。冇錯，揾你哋幫手。
點幫手啊？勤潔手就係好幫手。
喺護理病人前後。
食嘢之前。
食藥之前。
咳嗽或打乞嗤之後，要用梘液或者酒精搓手液潔手。
去完廁所就一定用梘液洗手。
無論用梘液抑或酒精搓手液，都要搓手最少20秒。
善用抗生素，
加埋你哋勤潔手，惡菌就冇路走。
Current events, controversial issues, in-depth accounts of the latest news and happenings that impact us all. Get to the heart of the matter. Get the inside story, Friday night at 8.
On December 14th, let's uncover the mysteries of space. In celebration of the 50th anniversary of Macau's handover to China. Parade through Macau, Latin City.
More local news. Hong Kong shivered through its coldest day of the winter so far, with temperatures falling below 11 degrees.
But first, in our local wrap, police are investigating a suspected suicide at the High Court building.
Over the past few years, many Americans have been complaining that their country is turning into a police state, where officers can seemingly do what they want and get away with it.